isn't working. Cheers. So the idea today is to talk a little bit about consolidation. And the way we're going to structure this session is, first of all, to give you a little bit of a background to the Global Internet Report that we recently released. I don't know how many people here have had a look at the Global Internet Report. Everyone. That's, well, maybe not everyone, but almost everyone. That's very good news, because I'm going to give you a very quick sort of run through what it says, sort of the main takeaways from it, the main components of it. I'm also going to take you through how it connects to the work that we're doing in 2019, how we're structuring that work, and how we're trying to learn a little bit more about consolidation. And then the third component of this session is really to sort of draw from that brain trust that Nick was mentioning and really try to get from you guys your perspective on some key questions that we've identified and hopefully help us learn a little bit more. So at some point, we're going to break out in breakout groups and try to have a little bit more in-depth conversations around some of the topics that this report raises. But starting with the Global Internet Report. So for those of you who have read it, I hope that you saw that this is really the overarching question of the whole report. This is what was guiding the work in 2018. We called the work the Global Internet Report 2019, but it was actually produced in 2018. But the work that we did in 2018 was really much guided by this question. This was sort of the lens through which we approached the topic of consolidation. Are there trends of consolidation in the internet economy? And if so, how will it impact the internet's technical evolution and use? And in that sense, in that regard, it's quite useful to start with two key definitions in this report that we usually get questions around. First one is around the internet economy. How do we define the internet economy? Not least given that virtually all parts of the economy is today connected in one way or another. So the way that we try to find a definition that would be workable in this report, we describe the internet economy as this: those economic activities that either support the internet or are fundamentally dependent on it. So if you think about a economic activity that supports the internet, that would be something like an internet service provider, might be a hosting provider, something to that effect, while a economic activity that is fundamentally dependent on the internet would be something like a online streaming service, a social network, something that wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for the internet. So you can think about that in contrast to, for example, your local pizzeria that might have existed even though it didn't have a web page of its service. Trend of consolidation here. We speak throughout this report around trends of consolidation, and for a very important purpose, which is that we realize that in order to speak about consolidation and to the extent a particular market has consolidated would require a much more in-depth analysis than what we're doing in this report. What we're really trying to achieve here is kind of a bird's eye view, giving a broad of a picture as possible of the internet economy and the economic activities involved. So therefore, we're quite specific about talking about trends and not affirming that it's necessarily in a state of consolidation. But we define it as trends in market concentration, vertical and horizontal integration. So vertical and horizontal integration would be, vertical would be where you, as a company, might be acquiring some other company that is part of your production chain, for example, while a horizontal integration would be you acquiring a competitor or integrating a competitor into your own service. Of course, fewer opportunities for market entry and competition, anything that sort of raises barriers to entry for other actors in the market. So those two definitions quite useful to have in the back of your mind as you're reading this report and thinking a little bit about the work that we did. The notion of the internet economy here, and I'm going to talk a little bit how we broke it down further, but also this notion of consolidation as we describe in this report. But the report is structured in these 5 parts. Obviously an introduction, but then the 4 main parts is section 1, where we talk about the trends in the internet economy, where we're really trying to provide this bird's eye view of what's going on. Section 2, we're trying to distill some of the key features. What do we think are important takeaways given these trends that we've seen? What do we think deserves further analysis and thinking from the internet society and our community? Section 3, we're trying to distill a little bit the implications of this. Spoiler alert, one of the main implications is that we need to learn more, and that is very much the focus of what we're doing in 2019. And then section 4 are the outcome questions, which is really guiding the work that we're doing in 2019 and which we'll also be focusing on in this session later on. The scope of the report, I put it 40, 50 pages. I think those of you who have read it have noticed that it's actually longer, but 40, 50 pages is more sort of an indication depending on how you think about the formatting. I think in text, it might be around 40, but with images, etc., it gets a little bit longer. But the audience for this report is really the ISO community to sort of enable both ourselves in the sort of more narrow ISO community of our chapters and members, but also our broader community of other fellow colleagues in the internet community to can we think about consolidation, create a first sort of frame that structures the problem a little bit and helps us think about it. Other parts of the audience is, of course, policymakers and a broader public, where part of the reason why we're writing this report and why we're raising the issues that we do and in the way that we're doing it is that we want to kind of connect between different audiences, where within the internet society community, we might have an understanding of what the internet is that is quite different than what the broader public see as the internet. The broader public might be very much focused at the applications layer of the internet and see everything they experience and think about when it comes to the internet relates to that applications layer. So we want to try to communicate that the internet economy has multiple layers and many important domains that might not be obvious to the user. We're starting with this section 1, this sort of bird's eye view of what's happening in the internet economy. We split it down further into 3 main domains, and there was a certain rationale for splitting it in these 3 buckets. The first one here to the left, as you see, internet applications. One of the, well, there were both analytical reasons for it, but also sort of communicative reasons for it, was that we wanted to really communicate to a broader audience that the internet has different layers. And when we talk about many of the services that are today grabbing a lot of the attention in the broader public, we're really talking about internet applications, services that make use of the internet. The second one here, access provision. We distilled this one as a separate domain for additional tactical purposes. The main one was that access provision is very much a local service. So you could have within a country, you might have different parts of the countries facing a completely different market than other parts of the country. So it's very much a local market in many instances. So it was hard to distill sort of a global trend when it came to consolidation trends and access provision. It was actually one of the harder sections to write in this report for that very reason. The last one here, service infrastructure. Service infrastructure really encompasses all those economic activities that helps the internet happen, if you will. It includes economic activities like transit provision, different DNS services that like DNS resolution or DNS hosting, also economic activities like content delivery networks and cloud hosting, for example. So part of that infrastructure that helps the internet coming into being, if you will. And what we saw in this report is essentially when we tried to look at trends in all these 3 domains was that we saw trends in consolidation. I think the most obvious case is in the domain of internet applications, where I think most are familiar with what we're seeing there, where you have a very strong dominance in many instances of a few large providers, particularly in search, social media, for example. But what we're also seeing there is that some of these main actors are also sort of expanding out beyond their core service. So if you think about Facebook, for example, it's more than just a social media network. Beyond just having a range of other services or affiliated social media networks like Instagram or WhatsApp, when you go to Facebook today, you can actually spend a pretty good day also using it as a marketplace, for example. So the consumer business has become a part of the Facebook platform. Likewise with Amazon. Amazon is more than just an online retailer now. Of course, we're going to talk more about the cloud computing side of it, but the Amazon platform also offers you, for example, streaming services and things like that. So you can spend a very productive day within one of the big providers, and you're really sort of capturing many different economic activities on one platform. When we looked at access provision, as I said, this was one of the harder sections to write to distill global trends. But this section essentially tried to pinpoint some of the aspects that we think are driving size in access provision. Of course, economies of scale is an important factor in this, but we also raise issues like spectrum auctions and how that might favor incumbents in certain countries. We also point to how content providers like Facebook is getting involved in access provision and how that could impact competition in that domain. And the last one here, service infrastructure. Again, we point to what we think are trends in consolidation, both in, for example, transit provision, where you have decreasing transit prices that you've seen for many, many years. In part, this is driven by the fact that you have large content providers now deploying their own infrastructure for their private networks in order to feed content across the globe. So, for example, Facebook and Google and Amazon, they're deploying their own submarine cables in order to transfer data between their data centers across the globe, and they're not making use of transit networks to a lesser extent, I would say. Same when you look at, for example, DNS hosting, so those servers that are hosting the DNS records. Again, we see trends in consolidation, and we rely here on a report from Harvard that was pointing to a consolidation around 4 main providers. When you look at the top 1,000 domains in the internet, those top 1,000 that has the most traffic, I think it was 50% of those top domains. 500 of those were hosted within just 4 providers. Same when you look at the resolution side of the DNS, we see a trend towards the use of public DNS. So, for example, Google 8.8.8.8, and other public DNSs like Cloudflare. And there's estimates from APNIC, for example, that somewhere around 15% of all internet users make use of Google public DNS, for example. Same when you look at cloud computing, again, some familiar names there. When you look at, so there's a way of sort of distilling the cloud computing market between what is known as sort of infrastructure as a service and what is known as platform as a service. The way to think about the difference between them is that infrastructure as a service is really sort of they providing you with the hardware, but then the customer of that service they deploy their own operating system, for example, and other functionality. So they only really get access to the scalability of the hardware. While platform as a service incorporate other additional functions, including an operating system, but also specialized services like artificial intelligence or database management. And when you look at those different categories, when you look at infrastructure as a service, for example, you see a very stark concentration around, I think it's 5 providers, where you have Amazon has a huge market share, approaching 50%. Second in line, you have Microsoft, and then you have Google, IBM, Alibaba as sort of close followers. Same in platform as a service, you have those same actors, but then you have an addition of actors like Oracle, for example. But in total, when you're looking at those markets, it seems to be concentrating around just a handful of really large actors. And what we wanted to do in this report is try to figure out, okay, what's the implications of this? What do we think is important to consider in light of these trends that we're seeing? So this brought us to section 2 of the report, where we're trying to distill what we think are the key features of this consolidation trends. And this is really where we will have the discussions today. In essence, what we're going to do after this presentation is sort of break out into smaller groups and then focus more specifically on one of these topics and try to go a little bit deeper. But to run you through them quite quickly, the total service environment, you start from the top left and go our way down. Total service environments is it's a section that's trying to describe how, both from the consumer side as a user, but also from, for example, the perspective of a small or medium business, you're really facing kind of a total service environment, a one-stop shop, if you will. From the user side, you experience this when you spend a very productive day on the internet just using, for example, all of Google's services. So you don't really need to exit the Google ecosystem to use any other service. You can use your mailing, you can search, you can do shopping. So you're facing that sort of total service environment where you as a user don't really need to use any other services than one provider. The same is true when you look at from the perspective of small and medium businesses, where especially if you approach it from cloud computing, if you're a small or medium business and you're entering with a new innovation or trying to start up your business, you have access to quite incredible infrastructure if you use a service like Amazon. You have access to their content delivery networks. You have access to some of their very frontline artificial intelligence capabilities. And not least DNS hosting as well, for example. So you can really get everything you need from one-stop shop. And that is offering quite an incredible infrastructure that wasn't even available for the biggest actors just 5 years ago. So this global infrastructure offers some quite incredible opportunities for small and medium businesses as well. But the question we raised there is this sort of trend towards total service environments, is that inevitable? Or is there a path where we would have a greater diversity? Interoperability is a function of scale. This second part of the section. Here we're trying to describe what we think the implications are for standards development and deployment. So here we raise issues like, in many instances, you have very good outcomes from the fact that you have concentration, especially if you look at standards deployment, and you think about protocols or the switch to IPv6, for example, where a lot of the big players are doing that switch, but also nudging others to do the switch as well. So if you take the App Store and Apple, for example, have a requirement that you should be IPv6 compatible. Other instances is, for example, Google Chrome is nudging the use of encryption in the web by having a little mark in your browser saying not secure if the web page that you're visiting doesn't have encryption. So those kind of positive implications that we've seen purely from nudging the behavior and good practices. But we're also raised the issue that in terms of standards development and deployment, you have, for example, now a protocol under development called QUIC, which is thought to be a replacement of TCP/IP, which was originally originating from Google. And what was kind of remarkable with that protocol is the way that it was tested over its lifetime before it entered the standardization process, where Google had a control over the browser side and a huge market share there, but also control over the servers on the other side. So they could test this protocol at a scale that wasn't really available for any other provider out there. Now that standard is, or as I said, that protocol is being standardized in the IETF, so it is an open protocol, but it raises the question as to if some actors out there have a very unique position in terms of promoting new protocols. Same thing, we're raising the issue of DNS over HTTPS, which I'm sure many of you have heard about that debate and the discussions around the implementation of DOE, where essentially you were doing DNS queries over HTTPS, and the unique character there is that the web browser can dictate the DNS resolver that you're using, so that would sort of further increase the trend towards using public DNS. And all of that comes down to the fact that you have a few players having a huge market share that can have a significant impact on new traffic patterns and uses in the infrastructure. The third one here around the changing internet topology, it's very much inspired by an argument by Jeff Houston from APNIC. I'm not sure if people are familiar with his argument about the death of transit. That is sort of a starting point, if you will, for what we're writing here. We're not necessarily taking it to the same conclusions as Jeff is doing, but it's very much inspired by his argument and comes back to this notion of a decreasing reliance on transit and the fact that you have a more densely connected edge of access networks, both through IXPs and also due to the fact that you have content delivery networks bringing the content closer to those access networks and caching it closer to the user. So the implication of that is that you have a change in the internet topology where you used to have a greater reliance on transit and now you have a more densely connected edge. And the question we raise here is, given these trends, is there a future where the general purpose internet gets shifted to the background, where investments are no longer sort of targeted towards providing infrastructure for that general purpose internet, but rather specialized networks, both in terms of shipping data across the globe, but also in terms of that last mile access provision, especially when you have the emergence of what's known as the sort of intelligent edge, where you bring more of the computing capabilities into the access networks. But also issues like 5G is sort of tangent to that. The fourth one here, deep dependencies. I think the sort of illustrative keyword there is that we talk about we raise the question as to if there is a risk of too big to fail scenarios, both in the case of sort of economic dependencies in some of these big platforms where you might have a service disruption that then cascades up to other layers where you have other businesses dependent on that particular service and what happens to those businesses that are dependent on a particular service if it was to fail. So an illustrated case could be that in many parts of Africa, for example, smaller businesses aren't using web pages. They're really relying on Facebook, for example, to market themselves. So a lot of that sort of local economy is very concentrated on Facebook platforms. Let's say you have a big service disruption where Facebook isn't available there. What happens to those smaller businesses that might use Facebook for its marketing? But it could be other issues as well. And also from a technical perspective, if you were to have a service disruption of for example, a service where another application makes use of that service. So the best case to think about is, for example, Google Maps. Let's say that you have a disturbance where Google Maps fails. And you have another set of applications that are actually relying on interoperating with Google Maps in order to deliver their business. In that case, would you have these kind of cascading effects on the economy where other businesses and applications are dependent on a particular service? And the big question there is to the extent that there's a substitutability of those services. If that were to happen, if you switch to another provider and sort of keep things running, or are you very much dependent on one actor? And the sort of end argument there is that if this is the case, we're worried to the extent we would have some of these services getting kind of a favored position on the internet and really undermining what we think is one of the critical principles of the internet, which is that it doesn't have any permanent favorites. But if you have certain services that others are critically dependent on, service providers that others are critically dependent on, could you have an instance where, for example, government goes in and regulate them and give them a kind of a favored status in order to ensure that they keep running? The fifth one here, response to consolidation. This is really a section where we're trying to summarize what we see out there happening at the moment. A large part of it is focused on what actions governments are doing at the moment, both in terms of addressing specific competition issues. So, for example, the European Commission case against Android and Google's use of Android, but also where governments might be sort of addressing this indirectly, where we see concerns around fake news, for example, is being framed in a discussion around the dominance of few large platforms and how information can propagate on big platforms. And so it indirectly relates to this concern around consolidation. Other examples we raised there is, for example, how the technical community, illustrated by not least Tim Berners-Lee, very ambitious project of decentralize the web, another response to these trends in consolidation that we're seeing. So that was a summary of that section 2, and this is really where we're going to focus the discussions today. I'm going to skip this slide quite quickly because, as it says at the bottom there, the main outcome of this report is that we really need to learn more. We took this bird's eye view, looking at economic trends. We wrote the section where we think these are important features to focus on and to learn more about. But we also realized that we really need to learn more. We didn't have the data that we required to actually make a clear statement as to the extent some of these trends are good or if they're bad. We saw both positive and very good benefits from some of these trends, but we also saw some concerns, and we don't really know how it's playing out. We really felt like we need to learn more both about the trends in consolidation and what possible implications it could be. And that led us to this. I don't know if you've been sort of keeping track of the Internet Society's previous global internet reports, but we usually end those reports with a set of recommendations, what we think needs to be done in relation to a particular topic. In this case, we didn't end up with recommendations. We felt we couldn't really pinpoint the topic well enough to actually make clear recommendations. So instead, we wanted to use this report as a bridge to further work. So to that effect, we came up with these outcome questions that are very much inspired by that section 2 that I just walked you through. And the idea here is to inspire a broader community to sort of pick up where we left. Have other researchers look at these questions and see if they can make progress on it. Our community, the people that are in this room here today, how can we contribute to this thinking around these outcome questions? And I'll stop there, see if there's any questions. I'm going to sort of connect back to those outcome questions in a moment, but if there's any questions at this point. Yes?
Do you have any preliminary assessment about the influence of the European Electronic Communication Code from the next year? Because for the first time, over-the-top services are included in the scope of electronic communication service, and this is okay. Part of the telecom regulation is covered, will cover also the internet world, and how this will influence to the whole picture.
So I haven't looked at that in particular, but this is definitely a case that we'd love to have discussed in these breakout sessions that we're doing, people that might have more details around that particular proposal. Because you will see one of the questions that we have here is really how responses to concerns around competition in the internet economy could potentially produce unintended consequences for the internet itself. That's really one of the focus questions that we're going to have for this breakout discussion. So it would be great if I'm going to sort of pinpoint you for that group to meet people that have more experience around particulars. But if there's no further questions, I'll go to the work that we're doing this year. So the way to think about this is the work that we did in 2018 amounted into this. That was the result of what we were doing. We came out with this report. We summarized it in this report according to these sections. But the main takeaway was that we needed to learn more. And that's where the outcome questions came in. So what we're doing in 2019 really kicks off where the last work ended. The GIR outcome questions are really what we're trying to use as structure for what we're doing in 2019. We felt that those questions would be useful for more in-depth research. We also felt that they would be a very suitable way of engaging external researchers, because given that we couldn't go much deeper than what we did last year, and we felt like the in-house expertise that we had wasn't sufficient to actually bring conclusions, a very important part of the strategy that we're using this year is to engage external stakeholders, researchers, both within our community and also the broader public, to engage on this topic and sort of use the GIR as a way of framing the problem, framing the issues, and then have others pick up the mantle, if you will. So engaging external researchers and external thinkers is a critical part of this year's project. The team working on this is very much an interdisciplinary team. So I'm the project lead, so I'm from policy, but in that team working on this year, we have members from our technical team, from our development team, really trying to bring in a broad set of eyes and expertise on this, because the issue of consolidation really has both policy dimensions and technical dimensions. And you really need sort of a holistic approach to this topic. And that's why I'm really excited for this room, where I heard that we have both very strong technical backgrounds, very strong policy backgrounds, and a lot of diversity in this room. And I think that's really what we need in order to think about this topic. So the way we do it this year is that we have kind of like two main research components. The first one is that we partnered with Chatham House on a special issue on the Journal of Cyber Policy, where we solicited input for abstracts of interested researchers, both within our community and the broader public, to come up with ideas guided by these outcome questions to propose further research and studies that they would like to do. That application process has closed, but we were super happy about the results. I think we got something around 40 proposals, which is very, very good for this journal that usually has a rejection rate of 30%, and now we're going to have something around 75%. So that's very, very exciting for us. We got a really broad set of proposals as well, both very technical ones, but also very policy-oriented ones. Very interdisciplinary collection of proposals. And the launch of that journal will be not until Q1 of 2020. So we're currently at the state of really evaluating the selection of the final 8 to 10 that's going to fit in the journal, and then going to work with the authors in finalizing that research during the rest of 2019. The second component here is funding for data collection. I hope that most of you might have seen these opportunities on our website, but we're going to try to push this opportunity a little bit more and make it more visible. But the idea here for funding for data collection is really to continue the strategy of engaging external thinkers, external creativity. What we're doing is that we're offering funding for people that want to go out and collect data on something related to consolidation. And I say something related to consolidation because that's where the creative thing comes in. We're looking for others to help us identify what is a useful indicator related to one of those outcome questions. So again, it's the outcome questions. So it's sort of steering what we think are the relevant issues to look at. We're really looking for external researchers to help us with the creative ideas of what is a useful indicator, how would you collect it, etc. And then the idea is to take those data sets and make it publicly available under Creative Commons licensing so that others can do further research on it to try to help stimulate the broader community to learn more about this. Third component here, interviews, consultations, and a little bit of internal research. This is really why I'm here today, that consultation component and interview component. And again, it follows the same logic. We really need help from external brains and others' creative minds to help make progress in this. And then we will sort of wrap up this work at this year's work at an event at Chatham House in early December. So, to help us learn more, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm hoping that we're going to achieve today. So, as I mentioned, we have those outcome questions, and the idea here is to split us out into 5 groups, where each group gets one of the outcome questions and try to think a little bit more deeper about it. Both about in terms of if you agree with the question, the sort of state of things based on your experience in relation to that question, other research you think might be relevant, other sub-questions you think might be relevant, and then we're going to bring it back for a group discussion. But I wanted to start in that sort of breakout style because it's useful to have more in-depth conversation. Yes?
For when are you planning your speech in government consolidation?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah.
Government.
For when? Yeah. Are you planning your speech in government consolidation? Because it's not the same, but it's the same. Okay. Government trying to take their hand in the internet.
So increasing control falling under governments, a type of consolidation. Yeah, that could be argued, absolutely. And that's kind of a perspective that would be useful to bring into those breakout discussions that, sure, we're thinking about consolidation here in terms of sort of control of the internet infrastructure falling under the hands of a few players. But it could very well be that one of those players is government. So that is an important angle to raise, absolutely. Given that we have sort of a diverse group, I figured I was going to try to indicate roughly what the different questions are going to be about. It's not a perfect illustration, but it's approximation of what I think that the questions are sort of requiring in terms of background expertise or where I think the discussions are going. So the first group are going to get a question that I think is suitable for a more technical background and where the discussion might be more technical, while group 5 would be the total opposite, where I think the sort of background that you might want to bring is more of a policy experience and maybe where you see it as more of a sort of a map of comfort. If you feel comfortable talking about very technical issues, group 1 would be it. If you feel comfortable talking about very policy-oriented issues, group 5 would be it. And then in between, it's sort of a mix in between. But I wanted to give you sort of a rough sense of what the different questions are about. So to that effect, I wanted to see if we have, do we have any participants here that feel like I really should be in the tech-heavy part? I'm looking at Hans Peter. We wanted to do policy. Well, I'm hoping we can have a mix. I mean, what's important around all these topics is that you really need a mix of perspectives. Even if the group one is sort of a tech-heavy one, it doesn't mean that you cannot contribute as a policy person. All perspectives are really valuable. This is more an indication of where I think that sort of the lingo might go. On the other spectrum, do we have someone who feel like, I really want to be on this policy-heavy group? Two people, okay, good. Okay, so we have a first indication. If you're business heavy, you can go wherever you want. No, that's a good question. I mean, it's not intended to be sort of a split between stakeholder groups. It's really more where you sort of comfort in terms of background knowledge and lingo might be. But the idea here is to break out into those smaller groups. Yes. I actually made a selection of those outcome questions, and I didn't pick the one around development.
But when does the mixing part come? If the groups are specified into one?
They're not specified. This is just sort of a rough indication, sort of people will get.
No, if they are specified in their discussions, like the technical discussion, the policy discussion, then when does the mixing come?
So in part, the mixing comes back here, where I'm hoping that the groups report out what they found and how they communicate that to the other groups. So if you were in a technical group, for example, you need to make sure that your findings are communicated in a way that the policy group also understands it. But this is not to split up the group in policy people and technical people. It's more of a rough indication so that you can get a hint of where it's heading. And I'll give you an illustration. I'll run through the questions just so you see why I came up with this division. As I said, it's not perfect. It's more of a rough indication. But for example, group one has these questions around how new protocols, standards, and practices championed by especially large organizations can have positive effects for some or for all. So hence, I was thinking, if you have experience of protocol development, maybe that is more suitable. But of course, I do think that it's important to have a policy perspective in there as well. It's more that discussions might be sort of more tech heavy. The second group here is around the new traffic patterns. And I've indicated here below, and you will see this when you go out in the breakout groups. So where can you find inspiration? Where was this question coming from? Which subsection of the report? So about new traffic patterns, that really relates to the discussions that we have around a changing internet topology. Group three would look at some of the things that we try to allude to in the total service environment, meaning that if you have a degree of concentration in a particular market, how much is that a result of the particular characteristic of the service itself? Right, so is this a service that is very prone to network effects, for example, that might be explaining parts of why you have that concentration. Group four, again, this question around deep dependencies. Are there instances where we could have something alluding to a too big to fail scenario? And I think it's important just to highlight when we're talking about those too big to fail scenarios, obviously it's very much inspired by the sort of economic meaning of the term. You think about banks, but it doesn't mean that a particular company or service would go completely bankrupt. It could just mean that a disruption is significant enough that it constitutes a fail that is too big for being accepted. It doesn't mean complete failure, it just means significant disruption. And the final one here, how to ensure regulatory responses to not interfere with the internet's underlying problem. So this would be the more policy heavy group. So that was the rationale why I was indicating the sort of background. Yes.
Let me question a bit the process. I mean, we have spent, or you have spent a lot of time to reach those, not conclusion, but open questions. Now, my point is, what can we do? Because in the first four questions or group, I see nothing but a diagnostic of the situation. We are observer, and we can see what is happening, but we are unlikely to be able to interfere as a individual, as a chapter, and so on. The only area where, as a chapter or as a ISOC member, we could interfere is the fifth one. So why don't we think and discuss about ISOC role in all this, and how can we participate in, contribute in achieving results based on what we decide that is ISOC role?
I think that's a good comment. And I think the way to bring it in is to have that as a checklist when these breakout discussions occur. Like you first want to get a good sense of the state of things, and then see, okay, is there a role for ISOC here to do something, and what would that be? I think that would be one of the asks for the breakout groups, to consider that. Given these discussions that you've had and the conclusions you might come up with, what could be a role for ISOC? But as I mentioned, one of the reasons why we're more focused on learning more than sort of focusing on what to do is because we really need to learn more, because some of these trends that we have identified, as I mentioned, we see them as trends, but we're not 100% convinced that they're all good, that they're all bad, and we need to understand more the nature of that particular development in order to understand what's happening, and what could be a good action. But I think that could be something that we include in these breakout groups, sort of tick the box for a discussion. Okay, what is the role for ISOC here? What could ISOC potentially do if we think that the trend is going this way? So I understood that we're roughly 25 people. While looking in the room, it looks like more. But we have a few extras. So could I get a show of hands of 5 people that would like to be in the first group? Technical. 1, 2. Oh. Who would like to be in this group? Show of hands. 2, 4. Need one more. Okay, we have 5. Perfect. So you're group 1. You will be located in the little boardroom down the hall. Perfect. That's group 1. You have a group 2. Show of hands. 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Group 2. You will be in this room. You will be at the table at the furthest to the back there. Group 3. We have 1. We have 2. We have 3. We have a 4th. We have a 4th. We have a 5th. We have 5. Okay. Yeah. So group 3 will also be in the boardroom down the hall. A group 4. We have 1, 2. Do we have some people for group 4? We had 1 interested. Let's see group 5. Is there a lot of people that want to be in group 5? Let's do this then, that we, group 4 will focus on group 5's questions as well. Does that make sense? Three and 4? Okay, so how would we structure that? So 3 and 4. Okay, so if you want to join group 3. Okay, perfect. Good idea. Okay, so group 1 in the boardroom, group 2 over there, group 3 in the boardroom, group 4 and 5 can stay here and we split you up evenly. Oh, and just a very quick look, please have a look at this. So when you go out to your group, please identify someone who's moderator, quote unquote. someone to report back to the group, discuss the one question, it says 2 questions, and then prepare to summarize it to the group, and we'll return here in around 35 minutes.